This time it's 5 motorcycles with flat engines. Over the years, many companies have used flat engines, both on 2 wheels and 4. Everybody from Ferrari to Porsche to Volkswagen in cars, and of course BMW and a whole plethora of other companies on 2 wheels. So here are 5 classic motorcycles that use flat engines. Condor A580. Swiss manufacturer Condor was originally established in 1893 as a bicycle manufacturer, like so many others, but it would move into motorcycle production in 1901. Throughout the company's history they would produce small numbers of civilian motorcycles, but were best known for their production of military motorcycles for use by the Swiss Army and others. And without a doubt their best known product was the Condor A350, which used a 350cc Ducati engine which they first produced in 1967, and intended for military service, it ran low compression and was in a soft state of tune, making just 17 horsepower. But before that better known model came the A580 Condor, which was introduced in 1947, and used an air-cooled flat twin engine of just 577cc. The engine was a flathead or side valve design, and so made a fairly modest 20 horsepower, at 4,400 RPM. But the engine did have plenty of low-end torque, handy for a bike often fitted with a sidecar. Transmission was of course shaft drive to the rear wheel, but it's the gearbox that grabs attention here. It may only be 4 speeds, but it's also available with a high and low range, effectively making it an 8-speeder, with top speed whilst in the low range being around 31 miles an hour, and in the high range it would be approximately double that figure. The front forks were a copy of a Zundap design, while the rear was initially rigid but would soon be replaced by plungers, and the all-up weight of the bike was 364 pounds or 165 kilos. Not bad for what is a quite physically large machine. There's no doubt these machines are a fairly rare sight outside of their native Switzerland, with only around 1,500 being produced in the 10-year period between 1947 and the end of production in 1957. BMW Motorrad. BMW is a company who specialised in the production of aircraft engines during the Great War, but with the war's end the company needed to diversify. They began car production by building a licence-built version of the Austin 7, but before that in 1923 they started their Motorrad division, and in that year would introduce the R32, their first boxer twin. This had a side valve engine of 494cc that produced around 8 horsepower. Top speed was around 55 miles an hour. There was a 3-speed hand-change gearbox and of course shaft drive. The engine had originally been intended for use as a flat portable unit, but had been used by several other motorcycle manufacturers as a power unit. So they reasoned if other people were going to use it, why not build a bike around it themselves. 1925 would see the R37, their first sporting model. This was based around an R32 but used an overhead valve top end and could produce around 16 horsepower. Into the 1930s and BMW began to experiment with telescopic forks with hydraulic damping in their race bikes, and in 1935 would release the R12 and R17. These are often credited with being the first machines to use hydraulically damped telescopic forks, although in fact this isn't quite true, with Nimbus using them first on their inline fours. Major pre-war landmark would be Ernst Henner's 1937 world speed record of 173 miles an hour, and of course the TT win in 1939. In both cases, supercharged versions of the 500cc engine were used. Towards the end of the decade, they would introduce the 746cc R71, a machine which would be built under licence in the Soviet Union. It would go on to form the basis of the R75 used by the Wehrmacht during the Second World War, where it's likely most famous for its use as a sidecar tug, with the sidecar also providing a driven wheel. The machine had a top speed, even with a sidecar fitted, of approximately 60 miles an hour, and made use of hydraulic brakes, which was no bad thing, with the unit weighing 900 pounds or about 410 kilos. Production of the R75 would continue through to 1944, with around 16,500 machines being completed. In the initial period after the Second World War, BMW were only permitted to produce single-cylinder machines, but they would be allowed to introduce their first flat twin in 1952, this being the R51/2. This was only produced for 1 year before later being succeeded by the 51.3. Both machines featured an air-cooled, overhead valve 500cc twin with shaft drive, of course, and plunger rear suspension. Forward into the 70s, and BMW would introduce the R75-5. This would arrive in 1972 and had a 745cc engine and a 5-speed gearbox, and with its Norton Featherbed inspired frame offered a major leap forward for BMW's road bikes. The 750 produced 50 horsepower and was good for around 110 miles an hour, but would soon be superseded by the R90, particularly the R90S with its famous bikini fairing, and the R100 series 1000cc bikes, best known of which is the R100 RS, with its extremely effective full fairing and 70 horsepower. This engine series would carry BMW into the 80s and would survive an attempt to replace them with the K series, and the series would spawn the R80 GS, BMW's first adventure bike, a machine inspired by BMW's Paris-Dakar success, and one which of course is very much with us today, although very much changed. In the early 90s these machines would finally be replaced by the R1100 and R850. These are what's commonly known as the oil heads and would feature, not surprisingly, oil cooling and a 4-valve head, and a major upgrade and complete redesign of the previous motors. But even these engines would begin to struggle with the emission regulations of the new millennium, and the 1200 of 2004 would be the last oil-cooled engine, before it was replaced in 2013 by a water-cooled version, derivatives of which continue to power the BMW Boxers today. Douglas 350s. The Douglas Engineering Company was established by William and Edwin Douglas in 1882 in Bristol, initially focused on blacksmith and foundry work. In 1905, one of their customers, Joseph Barter, was producing a motorcycle with a flat twin engine which he called the Fee, later anglicised to Fairy, a machine often claimed to be the first production flat twin. Although unlike later machines, these bikes ran their cylinders running fore and aft. Douglas made castings for the company, but would take over production of the bikes in 1907 when it ran into financial difficulty and began production of their own version with a 350cc engine, a capacity which became synonymous with Douglas. Douglas modified the basic design, moving the engine lower in the frame. During the First World War, Douglas would become a major supplier of motorcycles to the British Army, supplying some 70,000 machines during the course of the conflict. In the 1920s, Douglas would continue the production of their ever-popular 350, but would also make a 964cc version of their engine for the Williamson Company, some of which used water cooling. But Douglas engines too would gradually increase in size from 500 and 600cc, and these machines would be popular sporting mounts, used in competition both at the Speedball at Brooklands, but also in Speedway, which had come over from Australia, and other forms of dirt track racing. 1934 would see the introduction of the 494cc Endeavour, a machine which would see Douglas breaking tradition and rotating their engine so that the cylinders ran across the frame, and the side valve machine would also feature shaft final drive. In the post-war period they would introduce the T35. This ran its engine in the same way as the Endeavour but now featured chain drive and was also overhead valve. The machine would be available in a number of sporty derivatives including the 85 and the 90 Plus. But perhaps its most interesting feature was its front and rear suspension systems, which relied on torsion bars rather than coiled springs for dampening. But Douglas was a company which was always fairly poorly financed, and the development of these new machines put them into some financial difficulty, and so these would eventually be replaced in the mid-50s by the Douglas Dragonfly, which was not dissimilar but featured more conventional suspension systems and was a generally more reliable machine. And in 1957 the company was taken over by Westinghouse Brake and Signal Company Limited, who would end Douglas production in 1957, although Douglas would continue to import Vespa scooters and Gilera motorcycles. The Honda Goldwing. In 1972, Honda began development of a new flagship for their motorcycle range. The development team was tasked with producing a design which would be more suitable to the American market, one that could cover large distances in comfort. So they moved away from the standard transverse 4 design and used an inline boxer 6, in the prototype at least, but would subsequently decide that the engine and powertrain of the 6-cylinder M1 design was just too long for a production motorcycle at that time, and would instead chop 2 cylinders off the end effectively to produce a 1000cc boxer 4 with belt-driven cams. Don't let anybody ever tell you that belt-drive engines aren't cool and aren't classics. I give you the Goldwing. The first Goldwing model went on sale in the United States in 1975, its primary market of course, and with its smooth-running shaft drive 4, 80 horsepower claimed, and 125 miles an hour performance, it would prove an instant success. The machine famously uses an under-seat tank with a dummy tank in between the rider's legs. This all helps keep the centre of gravity a bit lower. Handy because the GL1000 is no lightweight. I have ridden one of these and I have to say that when you're riding along it feels just fine. Low speed manoeuvring though, you do begin to notice that weight. That's 600 pounds or around 274 kilos, even for the first model. 1979 would see the end of production for the original 1000, and it was replaced by the GL1100, which had a touch more weight and featured an even more torque-laden engine. In America, companies such as Veta had always made bodywork and luggage available for the Goldwing, and so from 1980 onwards, the GL1100 Interstate would be the first Goldwing with a factory-fitted fairing, and this would soon be followed by the fully dressed Aspancade model. And so during the 80s, the Goldwing 4 would become increasingly extravagant, finally growing to 1200cc's in 1984, before being replaced by the 6-cylinder GL1500 at the end of the 80s. But that's another bike for perhaps another video. The Velocette LE. Many motorcycle designers have dreamed of making the bike for every man. Honda have tried this many times with varying degrees of success. Now this particular version of the Everyman motorcycle was dreamed up by Eugene Goodman, the director of Velocette. Designers Charles Udell and Phil Irving of Vincent fame were charged with developing the LE. They conceived as a whole design with engine, gearbox and driveshaft all in one unit, and a machine designed for a specific task. And what an unusual machine it was. Aluminium pressed steel bodywork, a 149cc liquid-cooled side valve 4-stroke engine, and shaft drive with a hand change gear and a hand pull start lever to start the engine. The machine was quiet, smooth and sophisticated, but it was also quite slow and rather expensive, at almost double the price of a BS8 Bantam. And so in 1951 an upgraded Mark II version was introduced with a more rigid suspension, improved engine and transmission bottom ends, and an increase in capacity to 200cc's and 10 whole horsepower. But while the British public was not so convinced about the styling, more than 50 of Britain's police forces were, however, and more than half of all the LEs produced would go into police service, where they would become affectionately known as the Noddy bike. Now this has nothing to do with the Enid Blyton character, and simply because officers riding the machines were told to nod to superior officers rather than salute. 1957 see the introduction of the Valiant. This was a much more conventional motorcycle based on the LE, but using an air-cooled overhead valve top end. In this form, the little flat twin produced 12 horsepower at 7,000 RPM and had a 4-speed foot change transmission. But unfortunately the LE bottom end proved fragile if worked hard, which of course it was because 12 horsepower isn't a great deal from 200cc's, and the high cost of the machine made it a slow seller, with a production ending in 1963. However, with those lucrative police contracts, the LE would go on for some time longer, and 1958 would see the introduction of the Mark III. This machine would make use of the 4-speed foot change gearbox developed for the Valiant, but would unfortunately be the final version of the LE. With the police moving increasingly into cars, rather like the rest of the population, orders for the LE began to dwindle. And when Velocette went into voluntary liquidation in 1971, a Velocette LE would be the final machine off the production line. Whatever bikes and collections of bikes would you like to see us do a future video on? Perhaps you've got a bike we can use for a test drive. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course thank you very much for watching.